Thank you for watching Conscious Consumer Network. The live stream broadcast is free to view. You can pause and rewind live broadcasts to catch up, or view shows at a later date by accessing our free archives of all shows. Check out our broadcast guide to see what's on. You can show your support by donating to our network support fund. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, or subscribe to the monthly newsletter for updates. We thank you for supporting free and independent media. The mainstream media and international community have largely ignored the atrocities and genocide that is going on in my home country of South Africa. As economic refugees living abroad, we as independent media fight to expose the truth and find solutions for the many suffering and impoverished people still stuck in South Africa. This is Stop South African Genocide, hosted by Mel V and Karin Smith, live on CCN.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you may be on the world. My name is Mel V, coming to you live from Conscious Consumer Network headquarters here in Portugal. It is great to be with you again, as always, for our scheduled broadcast of Stop South African Genocide. With me, as always, is my most esteemed colleague and co-host, Karin Smith. And of course, tonight's guest, Harry Booyens. What a privilege it is to have you with us. Good evening, Harry.
Hi, folks.
It's been a very interesting time for us very recently, a lot going on. And of course, getting to know your work has come at just such a necessary caveat for us. And I'm, as a researcher myself, truly humbled and honored to be able to speak to you, because you have written the most amazing book, which categorically recounts the history of our people, mine and Karin's people. We are descended from the Afrikaner Boers ourselves, even though we don't have the Afrikaner accent, or I must be honest, I don't really even speak my native tongue that much anymore, but certainly my parents did and my grandparents did. And if you trace my history back, we'd probably find that we're somewhere down the line. Our families knew each other and went through very much similar things. So it's a great honor to have you with us to discuss your work and also get your perspective on what is going on at present. First off, I just want to give a little bit of an introduction to the book Amabulu, which, Karin, if you have it there, do you have the book with you?
I'll get it in a second.
Brilliant. Please get it for me. I do want to reference it and also say that it was wonderful to be introduced to your book by American journalist Alex Newman, whom, thank you, Alex. He gave a most amazing interview to us a couple of weeks ago, and I'm very, very grateful for the introduction to your work by such an esteemed journalist, and really look forward to getting through the book in its entirety, because that is one mammoth effort, over 600 pages of history and research. So first, before we get tucked into the details, I want to say ask you to impart to our audience what inspired you to go down this journey of this particular gauntlet of research.
Well, it was a particular little event that happened around 2006, in that I was a member on a web forum, and I made a comment about farm murders in South Africa, and that this was extremely upsetting. And then some chap from Holland, the Netherlands, thought it wise to add the comment, yes, Harry, but you should tell folks here what happened before, as though anything on earth could justify what's happening in South Africa. And to the credit of all the American folks on that website, and they were 99% American, they really climbed into this Dutch gentleman and said exactly what I just now said, that nothing on earth could justify this. And then I thanked them and stopped them, and I said, well, actually, our Dutch friend is right. I should tell you what happened before, but would you mind if I started at the beginning, which would be around the early 1600s. And I could do that if you are prepared to give me a couple of weeks to slowly convey this picture. And so over some period of time, a month or so, I actually published this whole range of little articles about South Africa covering the history and saying, this is actually what happened. And folks liked it so much that they asked me which book was I getting this from. And I said, there's no book. And they said, well, then it should exist. So at first I rejected the idea because I'm a scientist by profession. I'm not an author as such. And then when another clever jack here in Canada made another sideways comment about how possibly such deaths are deserved in South Africa, I thought, okay, this is it. So far and no further. I now have an obligation to do something. And that started me on essentially a 7-year effort to collect all the data, collect all the information, put all the sources together, got it from 7 countries. And it, like I said, 7 years, 7 countries, and 7 tons of tears in putting this thing together. I do not mind admitting as a grown guy going gray that I many days I just typed through a face full of tears on this thing. And eventually this was then published in late 2013 and the printed version early in 2014. So it's been around for more than 3 years. And that was the reason someone had to do something, and it's no good looking over your shoulder at who else is going to do it. You got the problem, Harry, do it.
Yeah, Harry, that is what caused me to get involved at all with this. I didn't want to be a voice or a face for the South African story at all. But when I came to the USA, I was horrified to find out that nobody knew anything about South Africa post-1994, and that there was nothing on the news here. And I sat back and thought about this. So I got a radio host friend of mine to do a series of stories on South Africa. And I sat in the background and found the guests and didn't go on air. And she said to me, no, you are chicken. You started this. You talk about it. So I hesitantly put my toes in the cold water. And here I am 5 years later, still shouting the same story, still doing the same thing, still trying to educate people, and still getting the answers that made you mad in the beginning. That we, the white South Africans, deserve it because isn't karma a bitch? And those are the comments that you get all the time.
Yeah.
And it just drives us all crazy. So Mel, you and I are united in this. Damn, why won't you listen?
Well, we can differ on 1,000 things, but I think there's one thing that any person with a tiny grain of humanity has got to concede today, and that is that what is happening in South Africa is just pure, unadulterated evil. It is just beyond description. This should not be happening to anyone.
No, and it shouldn't be happening in a vacuum of silence from the rest of the world, Harry.
Well, I have some theory on that, which we can get to, but maybe I should just mention that the one oddity about this piece of work I did is that when I wrote the original articles, in each one, I added a little bit about, okay, so while this was happening in the country, what did it look like at home? Just the life of an ordinary guy just trying to keep life and limb together in South Africa. Mm. I put a little at-home section into each one of those articles. When I then collected all of these together, I gave them to a Canadian colleague. She took a look at this and she said, yeah, these folks are right. It has to be a book. And I told her, but the trouble is, it's history. Nobody could conceivably understand South Africa without the history, and the history is majestic. And she said, nobody cares about history. And I said, I think I can change that. And her comment was, well, you know those little at-home bits that you have in this collection of articles? you've got to somehow do that all the way through history. And I told her, but I was only born in the 1950s. I wasn't around before that. So how could I conceivably write anything about at home or whatever? And her comment is so typical, and it's actually inspiring. She said, how the hell do I know? You're the author, figure it out. And a very North American way of looking at things. And I thought, yeah, okay. And that's when I remembered that my mother-in-law had done a little bit of genealogy, and it occurred to me that, okay, I wasn't there, but my ancestors were, and they were just trying to keep life and limb together, just, you know, ordinary life of ordinary people in a very non-ordinary place. And so I did that homework. A lot of my time went into tracing my ancestors all the way back to Europe, Indonesia, wherever. Those sections were then written. And I tried to pick people who were as ordinary as possible. I didn't want to make any drama about that. The idea was that they were just ordinary folks. And the trouble is, because there were only 200 European guys at the Cape in the early days, doesn't really matter what you do. Some of your ancestors were the guys who were in the, you know, middle of the Troubles and things. And so unavoidably, I stumbled across the fact that it was my family members who were shot at the Slagtersnek exercise. You can go back. It was my ancestral brother who first said, "Ik ben een Afrikaner." I am an Afrikaner. And I thought, oh, I was just trying to find ordinary guys, but it seems like everybody has more. You know, our gene pool is not particularly deep. There's only 200 guys at the beginning there. And so if you go back 12 generations, you're bound to trip over the same guys collectively. And that made me realize, okay, well, all I have to do is, among these sort of 1,200 ancestors, let me pick the guys who happen to be at more or less the right place at the right time, at least in the district or vaguely near where events were happening. And that's how 1/3 of the book became a question of looking at the ordinary guys in their ordinary lives at that extraordinary time. And so I'm still not aware of anyone else who's ever done anything like that in any book I've ever seen in my life.
But Harry, that makes it real to people. In general, we're all just ordinary people, some in the right place at the right moment and some definitely in the wrong place at the wrong moment. And it makes it real. And that's what made your book so fascinating, because you're not just telling a dry history. You're relating it to daily life for real people that were struggling, and that is the Afrikaner story in South Africa, is the struggle. The ANC and their cadres all talk about the struggle, but for the white Afrikaner, it was a struggle from day one to the present, and it's never ended.
Well, I wish I could get folks to understand that, because I think that's a key aspect of the psyche of the Afrikaner. In fact, I went to Europe on a trip that I can at best describe as in search of the soul of the Afrikaner. And I thought, you know, naturally we were going to find it in Holland, right, in the Netherlands. It didn't work for me. So I went and looked at the Rhine, Germany area where so many people's ancestors came from. And it's interesting and all that, but still, it left me stone cold. And eventually I ended up in Provence in France, and tracing ancestors with names like, as we would say, Hubert, or as they would say, Jobert, Jordan or Jourdan, all those folks, Menard, Jordan, all of them, they all actually came from 3 tiny little towns, all within walking distance of one another. in the Aigues Valley near the Durance River in France, in Provence. And they were a major bloc among the French Huguenots. And if the Dutch were responsible for bringing business sense and good organization to South Africa at the Cape, then it was the French Huguenots who brought the heart and soul. And that's the way I would describe the Afrikaner as a nation. It got its tough-mindedness maybe, or bullheadedness if you wish, some would say, from its Dutch ancestry, the idea of looking well after money, etc., etc. That's all extremely Dutch. But when it comes to what makes the soul tick, there's a little French Huguenot ticking in every Afrikaner's heart.
Yes, that is so strange, because I said recently that the French Huguenots brought civilization. They brought music. They brought the arts to South Africa, where the Dutch brought business and laws and those types of things. They brought elegance, and that is one of the things. As you said, you cannot talk about South Africa without talking about the history, because that is what made the people and what is happening today. Without an understanding of that, you cannot look at what's happening today and have the smallest understanding of what's going on.
Well, that was the basis of why I wrote the thing. Is no one's going to understand if I just start explaining from 1948, or from, if you look at what people are doing with laws, no one's going to understand if I just do it from 1913. Or if you want to speak to the farmers in the Transvaal, you can't just start with the Great Trek. You know, even within South Africa, my one complaint is that a lot of folks, particularly in the Free State and Transvaal, have no idea of history really before the Great Trek. For many of them, that's the start of all that matters. And the reality is, if you don't understand what happened around 1795 to 1803 around Graafrenet in the Karoo, then you don't know what you're doing, because that is the essence of all of it. That is where the real thing that is South Africa was born. And there are all kinds of nice things that we can say about the Old Cape and the period from 1652 to 1795. But the Afrikaner struggle, if I can call it that, if we have a struggle, that struggle started in 1795. There were big problems before that, but in terms of the matters that defined the South Africa that you know today, you can trace it all back to Graafrenet in that period.
So tell us about that, Harry.
Well, let me fetch it just a little bit earlier to give context, if I may. Okay, so everybody knows that Jan van Riebeeck turned up on the beach at Cape Town at 1652. Now, here's the bit that many folks, many Afrikaners find, I guess, difficult to accept, but it's a reality. And that is that, and I'm a good example, because, you see, one of my ancestors was waiting on the beach when Jan van Riebeeck arrived. In fact, Eva Krotoa is my ancestor, okay, as is Pieter Nelleki van die Kaap. So those folks that books have been written about, yeah, they're in my tree. And most Afrikaners, if they go back, will actually find them there. At least hundreds of thousands of Afrikaners will find that. The second important thing is that my earliest international ancestor that arrived at the Cape was not Dutch. It wasn't even German. She was Indian. She was an Indian slave, okay? And she became a washerwoman at the Cape. My wife's earliest ancestor arriving at the Cape, my wife's a typical South African girl, My wife's earliest ancestor was my Ansela, Mooi Ansela, Maya Ansela, or Angela from Bengala, Bengal. She was an Indian slave. When the Dutch used the word slave for everybody who was either really a slave or indentured. So we don't actually know whether she was indentured or whether she was enslaved. But both those ladies ended up associated with a castle. So my wife and I both have an Indian ancestor who arrived at the Cape via Indonesia and served around Jan van Riebeeck. Okay? And not for a single second am I suggesting that we're very unique in any way. I bet you good money that if I trace back the ancestors of any Afrikaans guy who comes to speak to me, you're going to find one of those folks in that tree. Okay? So people need to understand that history, come to terms with it, and make peace with that aspect of it. So, you know, it is my ancestor, Ifa Kretua, who got messed around, like you keep reading in all these nice books that everybody would now like to rewrite and mess up the history. Nobody wants to talk about the fact that her one son was conveniently, possibly thrown off the back end of a boat. But history moved forward, and these guys started to spread out towards the east, largely through the Little Karoo. Okay, so there's a lot of history that lies buried in the Little Karoo. There was a long time that people referred to all of the countryside beyond Montague as being achter de Kochmans Kloof. That would be the I think I got the right name. The where the road goes through behind Montague, heading for Ladysmith in the Cape. And so that was the whole Africa beyond that gorge. Okay, and there was heaps and heaps and heaps of farmers who went out that way. They included the fathers and grandfathers of people like Louis Trichardt and those guys. And it included the Jordans, and it included eventually the Booyenses like myself. In the end, folks ended up spreading towards the Fish River, which was eventually declared the border by Governor van Plettenberg in the 1770s. And there matters stood. And the black people most certainly lived beyond that river. Now, here's the first important truth that I don't think a single American has ever understood until I told them. And that is that, no, there were not black people at the Cape when Jan van Riebeeck arrived. In fact, at the time that he arrived, they were the furthest or the closest to the Cape that they were was around about the southern limit of Natal, what is today KwaZulu-Natal. The Amaxhosa people were moving southwestwards towards the Cape, and there's a long explanation for why they moved like that, and it's very interesting actually. But they were spreading towards the Cape. As each father had a multiplicity of sons, the sons had to go and find territory, and they would spread out all the way forward along the coast. And I have some maps available to show these things if I can figure out how to share the map with you guys. If you're willing to entertain that, can I take that?
That would be wonderful, Harry. The more things you can share with us, the better. That's what we're here for.
So let me see if I can find that map for you. Give me a moment. Here we go. Yeah, let's try this one. Now, that should show you, I probably have to move it around just a little bit because it's so big. If you look at the bottom here, the Umzimkhulu River, okay? That's
sorry, Harry, it's actually not showing up. It's still showing your options page.
It's not showing the actual picture?
No, it's showing all of your options on the share screen.
I have shared. It's telling me stop share. So apparently it's not sharing.
Okay.
New share. Let's try new share. Go again. Still nothing.
Yes, there we go.
Okay.
Yeah, we can see it. Thank you.
Okay. It just wanted to be told to share again. That's the Umzimkhulu River on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. And for the folks not familiar with South Africa and its coastline, that's far up that coast, okay? Up the east coast of South Africa. And you can see how the different guys moved down. And eventually they started getting to the Kai River and then to the Fish River, which is, if you can see my cursor fiddling around the far left, that's the Fish River right there. Right. Okay. You see here something that I call Breintjieshoogte. When you see Breintjieshoogte, which is sort of northwest of Port Elizabeth, if you ever were to go there, it would be like an insignificant incline, little bit of a hill, sort of. But that is where the climate changes dramatically. West of that is barren Karoo. East of that is grassland. And that was a terrible, beyond Breintjieshoogte, to the east of Breintjieshoogte, was an area that folks were not supposed to go. But in the late 1770s, some farmers, including my wife's ancestors, asked pretty please from the governor, and he then said, okay, you can go there. And that became what is today Somerset East. Okay. Problem for me is that trying to explain that history even to somebody who lives in the Free State and Transvaal is difficult. But that area is where you would have found the farmers at their eastern limit in the 1770s. Okay? And at that point, they were in pitched battle, not with the black people, but with the Bushmen, the San people. So for those who don't know, I don't know how wide your audience goes today, but for those who don't know the term Bushman or San, that would be the people who played in the cult movie, The Gods Must Be Crazy. Everybody I've ever met remembers this little scene of the little Bushman throwing the Coke bottle over the cliff. Those are the San people, those are the Bushmen. They were the major problem that these farmers were facing. There was no trouble with the black people. And the black people all lived east of the Fish River. There were no black people west of that river. And so with one tiny exception, which I'll explain a little bit later, and well, might as well do it now. There was one group of people of mixed descent. They were of mixed mixed black and Khoi descent, and they lived around Alexandria, which is about 70 miles east of Port Elizabeth. Little patch there. To this day, that area is known as Kongus Kraal. It really should be Kungwa Kraal. But that is where Kungwa, the chief Kungwa, lived with his Amagunu Kwebe tribe. And they were of mixed descent. That's where they lived. And that was the picture for a long time. And that frontier was so difficult to manage that the governor eventually appointed a Veldwachtmeester, a master of the watch for that area, and then they decided they'd better have a little town, and they created Graaff-Reinet. So that gets us to Graaff-Reinet and its creation around about 1786. Up to that point, the entire civilization or the entire settlement of the Cape consisted of Cape Town, Swellendam, and oh good heavens, Stellenbosch, and then one place up further north, right, like Ceres or one of those. And that was it. That was the so-called colony in those days. And from about 1786, that is when one started with various kinds of clashes. The first clash actually happened in 1780. The first time that black and white got into a serious fight was only in 1780. That means it's 130 years after the settlement at the Cape was established. 130 years. That's quite a number of generations. So how can people tell me there were black people at the Cape when the Dutch arrived? It's a lie. It's a flat out lie. Okay. In fact, when the British took over the Cape in 1795, it was a huge event when some Indunas from the far east of the country turned up to visit the Cape to find out what is this new authority that's at the Cape. Okay? It was a big deal that two black men had arrived. It's a big event in the history of Africa. So it's really important that folks be made to understand that there was 130 years of history in which black people were not west of that Fish River. In fact, they weren't even west of the Keiskamma River, which is further east. Now let me share another little thing with you. The two important rivers east of the Fish River are firstly the Keiskamma, followed by the Kai, both sides, either side of East London. There's a reason why those two rivers have Khoi names. Keiskamma and Kai are not Xhosa words. They are not words out of black languages. They are Khoi words or Hottentot words, as people would have said in history. And that is because those are the people who lived there. Okay? So will people please spare me the rubbish about how white people came and just took the country from black people? Really? You know, shove the rubbish. I'm done with that. I won't tolerate it any further. Just come over here, look at my face, and come and tell me why those two rivers have Hottentot names, please. Okay? Yeah. That's where I'm coming from. I use real information. I will get you this from the books of the time. And when I tell you that a British governor in 1795 wanted to create a Khoi army to oppress the white farmers, then I say it because I actually have his letter to London where he says it. He says, I can conceive of no other measure that would put more fear into the hearts of these farmers than to raise a standing army of Khoi.
Wow. Wow. I did not know that, Harry.
So it's not as though we have to speculate. It's not as though we have to yell and scream and carry on and form political parties and do all kinds of funny stuff. The information is there. And the interesting and useful bit is that you'll also find it in the British archives. Okay, and this comes mostly out of books that were printed in Britain. They've been ever so helpful by committing their sins to paper. Okay. I've done my best in my life to learn the language of those who would mess me about. And I did that. I don't have a case with British as folks. For some other reason, most of my friends over here in Canada are British. And it has been true all my life. But I do have a case with various British governments, with the possible notable exception of Maggie Thatcher's. Okay, there are some really hideous things perpetrated by British governments in the name of a perfectly decent people, a perfectly decent, honorable people called the British, okay, with whom the Afrikaner probably has more in common than with most.
And yet dislikes intensely.
So
in general, the Afrikaner dislikes the English intensely.
Well,
because of historical things.
Let's. I have a bee in the bonnet on that subject. let me give you a little sketch, if I may, from my own life and a young man who worked with me. He came from Sheffield. And if you don't know it, the folks from the north of England, they can hold their drink. Okay, let's put it that way. From an early age, and this young man came to work with us, and I realized that there wasn't going to be a lot of money, so I told him, well, why don't you get the car with me, and then over the Easter weekend, I'll take you various places around the old Transvaal and just go and show you something. Otherwise, you're going to go back to England having seen absolutely nothing. That's just not right. So, yep, he's in, and eventually we drove this way, we drove Dradwood that way, saw the Kruger Park, all kinds of stuff. And then I drove him up towards it really was a little bit later, the Bosveld Hotel, okay, near the border of Botswana. Which, as I recall, was at All Days. Now, you can't get a more out-of-the-way place in the Northern Transvaal than All Days and still find a place to sleep. So there we were at All Days. We booked into the little Bosveld Hotel, and obviously everybody spoke Afrikaans, complete with guns and leopard skin hats and portbroek and all that kind of stuff that people always throw against me. And we, that evening, the young man said, look, he wants to go, as he put it, I want to go to the pub. Wants to go to the pub, right? So I thought, oh, Lord, help us. This is going to be trouble. There's a bunch of really groot Afrikaners at this pub. And this little Englishman is going to go into that. There's going to be nothing left of him. I better do something. But I just couldn't stop the young man. He just didn't want to listen. So eventually he went. Next morning, we couldn't get him out of bed. We wanted to leave, and he's still sleeping. So I went over to the registration desk, and I asked the guy what happened. And he said, you know, that young man came in here, and everybody tried to drink him under the table, and they couldn't do it. And in the end, he had them all falling about, and he was still standing. And so now he's just everybody's pal. Okay. And so when we finally got the young man woken up, I asked him, what happened last night? He said, no, it was fine. The guys are great. He said, what does neefie mean? Little cousin in English. And that more than anything describes for me the way I've experienced much of this. I find that, yeah, particularly in the Transvaal, there are still sore feelings against the Brits. But, you know, in the Transvaal, people were not executed for being rebels. My family was in the Cape. And I have not experienced any degree of horrid feelings against the Brits so much in the Cape Province. It is a little bit more intense towards the northeast, but that is where they did execute people. You know, and these things count. It's not for no reason that Betsy Verwoerd came from that part of the world, okay? She comes from the same town as my mother, or came from the same town as my mother, Middelburg. It's for the same reason that B.J. Foster came from that part of the world. Or as my grandfather said when Foster became Prime Minister, that's a good name. He has a good name in our fights, okay? But in terms of vicious hatred, I've not really experienced it, okay? At intense hatred of British governments and what they did, yes. But on a man-to-man basis, no. I've just not experienced it face-to-face, man-to-man, but it is an intense hatred of British government actions through history, starting all the way back from 1814 at the time of the Slagtersnek event, at which point I do need to point out that it's my ancestral brother that was killed by the King's men. Do I hate the Brits for that? No. Do I resent various British governments for that? Absolutely, you bet you do.
Yeah, well, isn't it always the government rather than the people that one resents and dislikes, because it's their actions that force people into wars, that force people, they decide. They sit there and decide it would be better for us today to go and fight these people, and they send us off there, as in the border wars in South Africa. Send your sons off there, send your husbands. I know that was necessary, but nevertheless, that decision is not made by the people.
When I listen to some of my British friends, and some of them come out of the Liverpool, Manchester kind of environment, I think their resentment of their government's various is possibly even more intense than mine. Okay, they have absolutely no trouble getting along like a house on fire with ordinary Afrikaners. That's how I've experienced things, is that on a person-to-person basis, we get on great with the Brits. When it gets to governments, man, just give me a gun. You know, that's sort of the attitude. My grandfather was the same. My grandfather was very nearly interned for being a Ossewa Brandwacht guy during the Second World War. B.J. Foster was interned because he was a Ossewa Brandwacht guy. But Jan Smuts's men only took off my grandfather's Mauser, his rifle, and they let him be. Okay, so I come from a family that you know, had folks executed by the Brits. Like I said, the beginning of the Slagtersnek debacle, which is really where Boer and Brit split, was the moment. That is the key moment. Everything goes eventually back to Slagtersnek, and Slagtersnek goes back to Graaff-Reinet. Yeah, carry on.
You were going to tell us about Graaff-Reinet. Yeah. And why that is such a pivotal place.
Okay. The folks in the Graaff-Reinet area, with this little settlement that was there, they petitioned to have this little town. Okay, so the town is created, they get their Landros, okay, and the first guy appointed is a man by the name of Vuka. Unfortunately, Vuka, he could not hold his drink, okay, apparently. And nothing seemed to work perfectly right around Vuka until one day he fell off his horse on my ancestral brother's farm. And he claimed his horse had stepped in an aardvark hole, and that he was riding on an English saddle, which was not well enough strapped to him, etc., etc., etc. All kinds of excuses. Eventually, Vuka is terminated. And lo and behold, and here starts the trouble, lo and behold, the governor, who never once visited Graaff-Reinet ever, that would be the Dutch governor, okay? That guy never once went to Graaff-Reinet. He appoints Meinier, a guy by the name of Meinier, appoints him as the Landros. He used to be Vuka's understudy. And Meinier was a misplaced son of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He believed in the noble savage and all that kind of thing. The more savage the individual, the more noble. And you see a lot of those people today. I mean, you know, a lot of savage folks on the African continent can do no wrong in the eyes of the liberal left in North America. Okay, they are to be, you should collect money for them, you know, until, of course, they hijack your planes and stuff like that. Anyway, Meinier is appointed, and it doesn't matter what the event is, Meinier says the farmers are wrong, and the Amaxhosa and the Khoi people are right. It really doesn't matter what happens. So eventually things got more and more intense until in 1795, the burghers, the ordinary citizens of Graaff-Reinet, who had their little committee, they were sort of the divisional council, if you wish, or regional council is probably a better word. The regional council got together and decided this is it. They're done with this. They are declaring independence, and they ran Meneer out of town, literally. And this is where I don't know how to put it, but sometimes I get the feeling there may even be some form of divine intervention in these things, because, and I feel hard done by on the subject, it turns out just as the messenger gets to Cape Town with a message that Meneer has been kicked out and that the independence has been declared, on that Sunday that message arrives, a purser from a British ship in False Bay also arrives at the castle. Both letters arrive at the same meeting, which the governor calls in a hurry on a Sunday night. Because you see, the British purser is bearing a message from a British commander of a fleet in False Bay saying, please hand your colony over to us. Your Dutch king has fled to England and has signed a letter that says all Dutch colonies will be handed to us until the end of the war with Napoleon. Okay? And at the same time, the second letter says, oh, by the way, your own citizens have just turfed your landros, your magistrate is the English word, just turfed your magistrate out of Graafrenet and declared independence. So in those... Sorry, carry on.
The guy was not having a good day, Harry.
His name was Sluisken, and I think he was on the way down the sluice.
Yeah.
So the point is, these in the very moment that the frontier Afrikaners declare their independence, the Brits appear on the scene. Not roughly the same moment, exactly the same moment, in the same meeting. Okay? So eventually, you know, the governor tries to resist the Brits. He doesn't believe the message that Napoleon has taken Holland. He doesn't know that Holland's fallen, or the Netherlands, etc. Eventually an American ship arrives and tells him that it's true, but not before his own commander is defeated. Well, he's sort of defeated, and the Brits then made a deal that says you will be allowed to surrender under arms, and your own flag can be kept out there. And of course, the moment they put down their arms, the British flag went up. So he felt cheated and committed suicide, which was a great loss. Robert Jacob Gordon, that's his book standing behind me here, or the book about him, I should say, standing. He was a phenomenal man, a great asset to the Cape, and he went home and committed suicide. And so started the first British reign at the Cape. That period of British control of South Africa will live in ignominy. It was a disaster. It was a complete mess born of idiocy, hate, and prejudice. It was that governor, the first guy, who then decided that, well, I've now been told about this insurrection at Graafrenet. And I hear, you know, essentially these guys have names like Joubert, Menard, Jourdan. They must be French Jacobins. Okay? We must put them down like these French Jacobins in France who are chopping people's heads off. These are monsters. We got to see to them. So that whole British administration of that period had this view of the Afrikaner as a closet Jacobin. Okay, they had no clue of what they were managing. So they he sent the new Landros Bresler to Graafrenet, but now the poor boere at Graafrenet, they're not exactly the most worldly wise guys either, so they promptly tell Bresler to take a hike as well. And so the British governor wasn't particularly impressed. This is not the way you dealt with Napoleonic Brits at all. And so, of course, you can imagine what happened next. So the Dutch sent a fleet, a very badly managed fleet, in conjunction with the French down to the Cape. The French didn't arrive. The Dutch got defeated at, I can't even remember where. But the Dutch fleet went down. It was a complete mess. And the Boere at Graaff-Reinet realized, okay, well, they have to concede. So they swore allegiance and all that kind of good stuff, and the Brits are now in control. But you can see we're at a point where things are in major upheaval. So the next thing that happened is what's known as the Van Jaarsveld Rebellion. It's an amazing rebellion in which not a single shot was fired. Which, yeah, it's typical. This is a rebellion by these Jacobins, right? So so through British eyes, these nasty Jacobins are doing a rebellion out in this terrible place that you can't even pronounce the name. What is this Graaff-Reinet thing, right? Anyway, so they eventually send a general by the name of Van der Leer. I don't know how a guy named Van der Leer ended up being British, but nonetheless, he's Van der Leer. So Van der Leer gets sent to go and trot around the flag and do all the kind of very good British stuff, you know. And so he goes off to that direction of Graaff-Reinet, and the Boere are watching out for this lot. Look, I'm missing out a whole bunch of history, but I'm going to keep talking for 6 hours if we go like this. But let's just say that this next round of trouble started when apparently Adrian van Jaarsveld fiddled a 7 to look like a 4 on his mortgage documents, and they wanted to drag him off to the castle. Now, I don't think you usually drag guys into a dungeon for, you know, cheating on a mortgage. But that's what the Brits wanted to do because Van Jaarsveld was one of the leaders around that part of the world. The other folks then resisted the magistrate. They freed Van Jaarsveld, etc., etc., and that is when Van der Leer was sent to go and stop this terrible Jacobin insurrection by these dastardly Boers, you know. Now, what Van der Leer did is he said, look, I will basically give you amnesty if you will surrender on the spot at a certain place. And the Boere arrived and surrendered at that spot, at which point he promptly took them all and put them on a ship appropriately named the Rattlesnake. And the Rattlesnake ship took them to Cape Town, where they were put in the castle jail. And there they would remain for 2 years. One of the men put in the castle, in that prison, was Martinus Prinsloo, who promptly got the name Martinus Kasteel from that, Martinus Castle. You know the way that Afrikaans folks give names. I mean, my ancestor who lived on the farm Skilpadbeen, his name was Matthias Booyens, who lived on Skilpadbeen. In my community, he would promptly and immediately be called Groot Matthias Skilpadbeen. Okay, now the same way Martinus Prinsloo became Martinus Kasteel. The governor instructs promptly that all the frontier farmers should have their guns and their lead and powder confiscated. So everything gets confiscated. The farmers on the frontier, unless they lied about where they kept other rifles, they, not rifles, muskets. The guys had muskets, okay? Voorlaaiers, old blunderbusses. And this stuff is confiscated, and on a dangerous frontier like that, the frontier farmers are unmanned just like that. Of course, what immediately happens is that the folks invade from across the border. And the Afrikaners on the frontier are left helpless. In that process, my folks die in a massacre at the foot of what is now Coxcomb Mountain, northwest of Port Elizabeth. If you've ever been to Port Elizabeth, you will always see this mountain peak on the northwestern horizon. That is Coxcomb. That's what it's called today. Its classic Afrikaans name is the Winterberg, and Groot Winterberg. And they lived at the foot of that mountain, and they were overrun by all these. It was a mixture of Khoi and some Xhosa tribes. Okay, those that lived in the Sierveld, or that had moved into the Sierveld. It was pretty grim. Everybody was killed on that farm, including my own ancestors. I actually went there to go and look, to get pictures of all of that. And it's when those messages reached the Cape that the governor realized, oops, something's wrong. I think I made a boo-boo. Took him a while to realize that boo-boo part. But he ended up, here's the ridiculous bit. Let me explain it like this. General van der Leer, the great British guy with a flag and cannon and all that stuff, who's going to march to the eastern frontier and impress these dastardly Boers. Okay, so our great hero van der Leer arrives at Grahamstown, you know, to trumpets and all that kind of stuff, takes our guys, shoves them on the rattlesnake, sends them off to Cape Town, then tries to intimidate Chief Kungwa. Remember I mentioned that name earlier, who lived at Kungaskraal, or Konguskraal as it's known these days. So he goes off there and he tells Kungwa, now, be a nice little native and don't leave your reservation. Okay? And you don't speak to Big Chief Kungwa like that. So when van der Leer left, he gets attacked by Kungwa's army, and in that moment, the first British soldiers to die in Africa died in that moment. Okay? So that was, I think, 1700. Now, call me a liar if I'm out by 1 year. Van der Leer promptly ran for what would later become Port Elizabeth, Algoa Bay. He gets to the beach. Okay? And on the way, as he's going along, he recruits Khoi people to join his army. But he doesn't seem to understand who he's recruiting. In fact, he is recruiting some of the invaders. Okay? He gets to the beach at Port Elizabeth, or what was to be Port Elizabeth. He gets there. The Rattlesnake, you know, or the other ships, Rattlesnake, one of them, lying in the harbor. Van der Leer gets to the beach with his cannon. He finds on the beach some of the Afrikaner inhabitants of the Eastern Cape huddled on the beach. They have fled. Half of them, well, some of them have fled westwards towards Cape Town. Another group fled to Port Elizabeth, the beach, hoping that the Brits will protect them on the beach. And another group, and here is where things get interesting, and neither the National Party the National Party would never have acknowledged this, and the ANC will also never acknowledge this. But I can bring you the hard facts, the evidence. The other little group gathered near what is today Cookhouse. I'm not even sure that folks know where Cookhouse is. It's east of Somerset East, south of Cradock. They gathered there, and then they went up the valley of the Booyens River, the Booyenskloof Valley. They went up there with their ox wagons, the classic wagon train, and they went fighting all the way against the Imidanga Xhosa that were attacking them. And here is where history gets fascinating. You see, while none of those guys were really folks who are going to write diaries and write things down and record for us what really happened, the interesting bit is that on one of the wagons, asking them for their protection and traveling under their protection, is none other than Johannes van der Kemp of the London Missionary Society, a man who would become the bane of the Afrikaner later. He's traveling in the same wagon train, refusing to help shoot. He just sits on the wagon. He lets his Khoi helpers do the shooting. He himself, of course, trying to play the great Christian, is not helping, but he's using their protection. Thank you very much. He records what happened, and he explains how, when that team got to the Tarka, which is the next region where that, if you go over the mountain from that valley, that's where you get to. They reached the Tarka, and then Piet Prinsloo, who was leading that little trek, family of Martinus Castile, Piet Prinsloo sets off, as recorded by Van der Kemp in the journals that went to London, all recorded, you can find it in London, go over the mountain to meet with the Xhosa chief, Gaika. Everybody's heard of Gaika, or Ngaika, if you wish. To go and ask Gaika for help. Because you see, previously in history, the very same Gagabe Xhosas have asked the Afrikaners for help, and they got it. In fact, the Boere were living in peace with the Gagabe, who were the most powerful Xhosa. The Afrikaners understood the frontier. The Brits did not. And the Afrikaners had learned how to live in peace with the Gagabe Xhosa. They knew that the invading Xhosa were not the Gagabe. They knew the invading Xhosa were spin-off guys from spin-off royal houses who were trying to cut out a patch for themselves. The Gagabe Xhosa were against these guys. The Boere were against these guys. Both parties fought these guys. So even as far back as the 1790s, the Afrikaner and the Xhosa had fought on the same side. Don't tell the ANC that. They can't handle that truth. Okay? So now, Piet Prinsloo goes over the mountain, meets with Chief Gaika, and he comes back with a message that says, Gaika says that he will send his Indunas, his captains, to come and stop the Imidange. Sure enough, day later arrives the just two Indunas from Gaika. And when the Imidange start attacking, these two Indunas walk forward and they speak to the Imidange, and there go the Imidange. It's the end of the attacks on the Boere. So the Xhosa had had help in war from the frontier farmers, and the frontier farmers had had help in their moment of need from the Gagabe Xhosa. Okay? Do not let either the old National Party or the new ANC disabuse you of the facts. These are the realities, and I can show you where Van der Kemp wrote it in his diary. Okay? So we don't have to make up stories. We don't have to have political agitation. We don't have to have any of that. All we need to do is have some respect for the facts as they stand recorded by people who had no reason to be as those facts back then. Okay? In other words, this is the kind of testimony that would likely work in court.
Well, Harry, it is amazing how even as South Africans, our history, which we thought was pretty good, and I still think it's better than most of the rest of the world, the history they learn, because we were taught about entire world history. However, we were still not taught the true story. And how many people have the will, the interest, and the time to go and do this kind of research to get to the absolute nuts and bolts of things?
Well, if I may just say that I looked at what I was taught about that period, then I read one or two books about that period, and I sat down with my wife. My wife is a PhD applied mathematician. She thinks very sensibly and logically about things. And I told her, Jean, this picture makes absolutely no sense to me. When I read the bits, even the great historian Thiel, who's a Canadian, by the way, wrote most of the basic books about South African history. I told her, I think even Thiel is messing the story about. So I started digging for the original documentation, tried looking at the original letters, found the diaries, all that kind of stuff, so as to figure out this history. I would just very quickly like to take you back to that bunch of people on the beach, if I may, where the Afrikaners had fled to the beach. Here arrives the British Army now with a bunch of hired Khoi people in tow. Okay? And when the Brits arrive on the beach with these people they have in tow, the Afrikaners basically do their nut because they're seeing the people who attack them on their farms. And they tell the Brits this. The Brits, not knowing what to do, set up a cannon between the two groups, and then they alternately swing the cannon to face either. Okay? That should have been some indication to Van der Leer that he didn't know what he was doing, that he had something wrong. Okay? The next night, the Khoi were gone. They realized the ruse was up. So they fled and they joined the other Khoi who were attacking the colony. Van der Leer at this point writes a letter to the Cape, to the governor, to say the governor must now call up the commandos of the Afrikaners, the very guys who he had just disarmed. And they must be ordered to come and help him, the great hero Van der Leer, on the beach. Okay? Now, I put it in my book that I think that must assuredly be the lowest point in the history of the justly proud British Army. I think the British Army has everything to be proud of. I think it's an amazing body. But that has to be the lowest point in its whole history. Not just that, the guy actually says he can still escape across the river mouth at the Gamtoos River to go west. And he's thinking to leave these now disarmed farmers and the attackers to make their mutual future. In other words, he wishes to desert his duty and make it look like it's a political expediency. Okay? I have none less than the diary of Lady Anne Bernard to quote what was really thought at the Cape at the time and not what the history books would later say. And she puts it on record that she was speaking to Van der Leer, and Van der Leer was gathering all his papers together because he feared he was going to face a court-martial. And he knew how badly he had screwed up. Okay. That is the kind of thing that happened during the first British occupation. Okay. So you look at what the Boere had done. All they were concerned about was getting rid of lousy Dutch East India Company magistrates. The Brits saw it as a Jacobin revolution. The guys have French names after all. Okay. What do the Brits do? They disarm their frontier. What happens? Their colony gets invaded. They lost half of the colony. The colony fell all the way to George. Will you find that in a history regularly written by white folks? No, they don't want to admit that they lost half the colony. They lost half the colony, all the way from the east to George. Situation was only restored when those guys ran out of stolen ammo. Okay.
And you know, Harry, that has got such similarity to the situation today.
Yes.
Disarm the farmers. Expect them to take it. I mean, history repeats itself, does it not? And there's a direct example of it, for me anyway.
Now you know why I am such a lover of history. There is nothing new on this earth. And if you know the history of South Africa, it seems so obvious to me, you know, what some of the things are that should happen. But I can't even get the ordinary Afrikaner in the Transvaal to understand where his history starts.
You know, there are those like you and I, history fascinates me. I'd rather live in history than live in the present, quite honestly, because it's less intimidating. However,
they had hope.
Love it and those who hate it, and those who learn from it, and those who just see it as unimportant. And you're never going to make everybody as fascinated with this history as we are, you know. But there is an example for people. Learn from it. Look back, see what happens, see what the results are, and it's repeating all over again under a different government, admittedly not under a British government, but nevertheless, it's happening again.
So you can ask me, so what on earth all of that has to do with today, without referring to how threatened the farmers are. Sorry, let me just stop this camera from shaking here. There we go. I should have known better than to put my feet on this. The point I would like to make is people need to lose this idea that there were black people at the Cape. Listen to all the history I've just recounted to you. That war that I just described, that invasion, was not so much an invasion by black people as a rebellion by Khoi people. And those people who point that out are quite right. It was mostly a rebellion by Khoi people, supported by those of mixed descent living in Kungwaskraal, and then opportunistically aided by some of the smaller Xhosa tribes living just behind the Keiskamma River, or wrongly living in the Seeveld. In other words, the real Xhosa, the sort of solid, deep Xhosa people, they weren't part of this operation at all. In fact, the frontier farmers went and got their help. Okay? The point, the reason I'm pointing that out is, even at that point, we're talking 1800 now, even at that point, the black folks were behind the Keiskamma River. So where the hell are they getting off saying that they were at the Cape? Now, I would like to move that history forward just a little bit. I want to focus on two little bits of history, and then I'll stop plaguing you with it. The next big move is that the British basically realized they'd made a mistake. They actually went and paid tribute to Kungwa and his guys. So here was the most powerful nation in the world paying tribute to men with spears. Unbelievable. It's on record. They paid tribute. The subsequent British governor actually wrote down, Governor Dundas had recourse to the only means left to him, which was to pay tribute to men with spears. That kind of settled things back, and eventually the British gave the place back to the Dutch in around 1803. Even as the Dutch were leaving, Napoleon got into a fight with the Brits yet again. So in 1806, the Brits arrived this time with, I think, 60 warships, a complete invasion. This was the real deal. They defeated the Dutch again, and this was the end of the exercise. From then on, the Cape was to be permanently British. So history moves on. Napoleon gets defeated, and the Brits make a deal with Napoleon, in terms of which not with Napoleon, with the Dutch. The Brits make a deal with the Dutch. The Dutch basically sell the Cape to the British. This is now after the war. Everybody says, yeah, we'll give things back that we temporarily took, etc., etc. As part of that whole settlement, the British then buy the Cape from the Dutch. So we were physically sold by our supposed ancestors. That is why there's not particularly much love lost between Afrikaners and the Dutch. They sold us to the Brits, and we became not citizens, but subjects. We weren't citizens, we were subjects. There's a big difference there, and it comes out in the Great Trek. In the wake of all this, there are investigations into claims by the London Missionary Society's missionaries, who were a bunch of liars. Really, they were. The judges said so afterwards. Judges really basically called the missionaries liars. The missionaries were claiming that the farmers had killed their Khoi workers, which is simply not true. And so started a thing that was known as the Black Circuit Courts. Those black circuit courts were pretty horrendous. None of these claims were ever proved. Yes, there were cases where farmers had abused some of their workers and they were fined, but no murder or anything like that. But now that border is really sensitized. That whole Graafrenet area that I keep talking about, intensely sensitive now because it's been made racial by the Brits. In the middle of all of this, at the end of this Black Circuit trial period, my ancestor, little brother, not a particularly wonderful guy, just an ordinary old guy living out, he's got gout actually. Sorry. He lives in that Booyens River where the guys fled earlier. Lives in that river with his, I think his wife was a Khoi lady. He lives there with him, with their son of mixed descent. And he's not known as a particularly major upstanding member of society around there. So I'm not going to attempt to sketch him as some great hero of the nation necessarily. But he's just a guy who's done nobody any harm. But he gets into an argument with one of his workers. And worker goes off to the magistrate, because they now know this is something that you do. Go to the magistrate, and magistrate says, okay, no, but this is not good. And by now the magistrate is the young Stockenstrom, Andries Stockenstrom, not Anders, but Andries, the son Andries, the father was Anders. Father Anders was killed by the Xhosa in 1811. So Andries Stockenstrom at this stage is the guy who's got to make decisions at Graafrenet. And he says that he has a subpoena delivered onto my cousin Besaidnout and Freek Besaidnout. So Freek has to go to court, but Freek doesn't turn up. He sends a letter to say, man, I'm sickly, etc., etc. I can't leave my farm, blah, 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 blah. And it is reported that he's walking around with a cane and's got bad gout, etc., etc. But Stockenstrom doesn't want to know anything about this, and eventually he sends his a number of troopers, British troopers and a Khoi sergeant and so forth, get sent to go and pick up the difficult Freek. Cantankerous old Freek with the gout and the kiri, right? The walking stick. And they get there, but Freek is a tough guy, so he holds himself up in a cave above the Booyens River. And I went there. It is a fantastically beautiful spot. So he picked a really good spot. So he's in the cave with his son, his mixed blood son and another guy. And when the army arrives, they start shooting. Well, I think he shot first. He warned them and he shot. He didn't hurt anybody. And one of these guys, one of the Khoi guys, climbs up along the face of the cliff and fires a shot into the opening of the cave, and the bullet that went into the cave killed Freek. The other two surrendered. This is the start of the Slagtersnek Rebellion. This is how it started, with the death of my ancestral young brother. So, and he's many people's ancestral young brother, by the way, not just mine, obviously. The folks in that area go to the funeral, and this is when Martinus Casteel's son decides that he is going to look for, well, he listens to Freek's brother, my other ancestral brother, who says that something's got to be done here. And he says, okay, no, well, they will stand up against the Brits. The time has come. To make a long story short, they deputize a team of guys to go to Gaika again and ask Gaika again for help. And then they tell him that we will let you know when you must come with your army. In the event, one of them gets captured, gets stuck in jail, gets interrogated, and Gaika actually learns about it because the Xhosa have their spies everywhere. So Gaika knows this rebellion, if it is one, is going nowhere. So when the guys call for Gaika to come with the army, he says there's going to be no such thing. These guys find themselves surrounded and they surrender. A handful of them flee up the same Booyens River again. It's always the Booyens River. Always the Booyens River thing in the district of Graaff-Reinet. And eventually Johannes, the other brother, also gets killed in that process, in a shootout with these people. So both brothers were essentially in the end killed by Khoi military men in the employ of the British government. In the end, the 5 of the leaders of this were sentenced to be hanged. And of course, then came the incredible moment in the history of South Africa when everything broke. Trust broke, faith broke, history broke, because the ropes broke. You can go to the little town museum in Somerset East if it still exists. It's now 4 years since I've been there. You will see the scaffold of the beam that the guys were hanged from. There's a long history around that scaffold. The Transvaalers threatened to hang the people of the Jameson invasion from the same scaffold later, 80 years later. Now, when they tried to hang the 5 guys, 4 of the ropes broke, even though the ropes had been doubled. So the ordinary, regular people felt that was the hand of God. You don't hang a man twice if the rope is broken. That's a sign from God that you shouldn't be hanging him. But they hanged them anyway. And things between Boer and Brit, talking about official Brit, has never been the same from that moment on. Before that, it was incompetence, anger at incompetence. From that moment on, it became a belief that these people want us dead. Okay? And if you listen to Macmillan's speech about the winds of change, when was it, 1960, whatever, that's a disguised way of saying, why did you're good chaps out here in South Africa. It's a very nice country and all that, and you've done really well for yourselves, but won't you just be good chaps and die and save us all the bother? Okay, that's really what that speech was. You know, you're in the way of what we'd like to do. You know, in a perfect world, there would be no white people in Africa. You would just shrivel up and die and then save us all the embarrassment of having to explain why the hell you're there. And that's it.
And that kind of covers the silence on South Africa today. It's exactly the same thing. Why don't you just toddle off? Because, chaps, we don't want to explain what happened to you or what we did to you or why we did it to you. So just toddle off.
Which gets us to the next crucial point that no one seems to understand, even in South Africa. In 1814, when the Dutch sold us to the Brits, they got the money for that, and with that disappeared any right of return that any of us ever had to anywhere else. So when Verwoerd responded to Macmillan by saying, this is the only motherland we have, he was 100% correct. Even if Malema wants white people to leave, excuse me, but where are they supposed to leave to? And who is it that is going to give them a home? Because Africa is the only home they have known since 1652. Which, by the way, my dear young Pedi, because that's what you are a Pedi, you're a member of the Bapedi tribe. Your ancestors, I don't think, ever knew what it looked like south of Pretoria. Probably not even south of, what's the town? Hardly south of Pietersburg. Anyway, so where do you want them to leave to? Because your ancestors never even saw Pretoria. What do you know about the rest of the country, you idiot? You know nothing. You don't know the history, you know nothing. You don't know the country. You know, just go back to your bush.
Absolutely, Harry. You know, it makes me so crazy, this you stole the land. And it appears that all the black people, the majority of the black people, are so positive of this that they're not even willing to listen to any other story or even think about it.
But you see, he's got power. And whoever has power is clairvoyant and right. And you should support them. You don't support them to give them power. You support them because they have the power. Okay? Power is all in Africa. So fact and history don't count for those folks. Okay? Now, you mentioned Malema. He was now recently in the Free State, and I'll probably write some sort of article about it not too long from now, where he started threatening the farmers in the Free State. I'm not even quite sure whether he knows where the Free State is. He was probably driven there without realizing what's outside the window. But here's the point. And this is where I want to share another little document, if I may, if this thing doesn't let me down. Let's just see what it does. It says, share screen. So it's not listening to me this time. So yeah, here we go. This document. Can you guys see that?
Yes, death notice.
Okay, do you see death notice at the top?
Yes.
Good. Let me read this for you, if you don't mind. I think there is some benefit to actually reading it. It says, Joachim Scholz, Joachim's son. That means he is Joachim and his father was also Joachim. So he's Joachim Scholz, Joachim's son. Birthplace of the deceased, Bokkeveld district of Worcester, in this colony. This colony refers to the Cape Colony because I got this in the archives of the Cape Colony. Name of the parents of the deceased, Joachim Scholz and Katerina, it looks like Elisabeth van der Merwe, both deceased. Age of the deceased, it looks like 50 years and 10 months and 11 days. Condition in life, cattle farmer, married or unmarried, widower or widow, married to Anna Jacoba Kruger. The day of the decease, on Saturday, the 8th of March, 1834, 2 years before the earliest part of the Great Trek. At what place where the person died? At Krom Ellenboog Spruit beyond the Great Orange River. Krom Ellenboog Spruit is in the General Forrest Smith part of the Free State. So my dear Julius, Joachim Scholz died in the Free State as a free man and farmer in 1834. Pray tell, where were your ancestors at that time? Still in the hills at Pietersburg in the far northern Transvaal? Or what exactly are you talking about, my friend? You get my point. Okay. So folks must be real careful when they start mouthing off as politicians because the facts might come to get them. Okay. There were Afrikaners living and dying in the Free State in 1834, 2 years before the Great Trek, okay, in the district of Forrest Smith around the Krom Ellenboog Spruit. In fact, that grave stood there until very recently. People have that gravestone in safekeeping. Okay, and it's not as though the ANC can go and destroy the grave and then pretend it never was there. This document you will find also in the British archives, and it is now in the documentation of the Mormon Church who keep all these things safely. So there is nothing Julius damned Malema can do about the fact that this evidence exists. Okay. This is why I wrote Amabulu. This is why the book Amabulu is, in a certain sense, the instruction manual for, let's be blunt, the white folks in South Africa who are fed up with this picture. If they've read that thing from beginning to end, they will understand who they are, why they are, and where they are. Exactly. Okay, and maybe they can start making like one people again, because right now they're a fractious bunch that don't know whether they're coming or going. There is nothing that demoralizes me quite as much as seeing these people fall apart over there in a completely leaderless, haphazard fashion.
Mel and I have done a show on the absolute need for unity amongst this horribly isolated minority group of people that just cannot get two or more of them in a room together and agree on anything. They need to forget their petty differences, stand together and make a future for the white race in South Africa. Because if they don't, Malema and his cronies are going to do what they threaten and wipe them out.
So that we sort of mentioned the word Afrikaner. I would like to get to another small point about it, and that is that in the 1930s, when the sort of Groot Afrikaner political awakening thing was done, there was one travesty that was committed in my book. And it's important that it be undone before these people can find their feet. And that travesty is quite simple. The best way I can explain it is as follows. When I went to go and visit the farm on which my ancestors died in 1800 at the Groot Winterberg, my host was a gentleman with a very English name. He was a descendant of the British settlers. And he was as Afrikaans as I am, a member of the NG Church, voorsitter of all kinds of things, okay? And he put me up for the night. He refused to accept any form of payment for me staying on his farm. They threw a big braai for me, a barbecue, a whole big performance. They made me feel wonderful, but I gotta confess, I got quite tearful at how my people were handling me. It was a remarkable experience. I felt like the prodigal son. So the point is, there was an artificial split made between English and Afrikaans. The Afrikaner is not defined by the language of Afrikaans. The Afrikaner is defined by where his heart is. My ancestral brother, little Bibo, was the guy who hit the magistrate at Stellenbosch with a bag of flour. And he yelled, "Ik ben een Afrikaner." He was making the point that his allegiance is not to Europe, his allegiance is to the people at the Cape. It is where the heart lies. I think the people who committed that travesty in the 1930s, they need to answer to the ghosts and souls of all the English-speaking guys who fought on their side in the Boer War, and there were many, okay? And I'm probably going to upset a couple of very stoere boere by explaining to them in this program that there were at least 5 Englishmen fighting at Blood River in a tel in 16 December 1838. I've made quite a bit of a study of all of this kind of stuff because, you see, I am a gelofte baba. My birthday is 16 December. So I take great care in these matters, and I therefore want to, with hundreds of years of delay, thank those British guys who fought on our side. This was not a fight between Afrikaners and other people. It wasn't even a fight to take anybody else's land. They had a decent and properly signed contract. Let me shut down this share thing. So the point is that we can take my wife, for example, if I may, and I think this is terribly, terribly important in getting South Africa back together again. My wife is an English-speaking South African girl, brought up to be every inch the English lady. Her mother was named Callanan. That mother's father was an Irishman named Callanan. He fought on Paul Kruger's side in the Boer War. He drove a train and then he spiked the train. He picked up a gun and he was made a prisoner of war under the British. His own father was a British Army guy. He was an Irishman in the British Army who arrived in South Africa in about 1856, that vicinity. The wife who married some of her other children from an earlier marriage, also with a British Army soldier, one of them was the editor of the, what was it called, the newspaper at Grafrenet. The name escapes me just for the moment. But it was a pro-Afrikaner newspaper. So these people were simply exactly what they were, English-speaking Afrikaners. There's nothing wrong with being an English-speaking Afrikaner. You have no idea how many folks have emailed me and told me, Harry, there's one big thing I got to thank you for. You've made it clear to me what I am. I've never quite felt like I fitted anywhere, and now I know what I am. I'm an English-speaking Afrikaner. Okay? And folks need to get that concept straight in their heads, because the supposedly perfect Afrikaners started off as German-speaking and, some Polish-speaking, some even Russian-speaking, etc., etc. What's wrong with English-speaking Afrikaner? Why is that suddenly in a different category? Afrikaner has to do with where you put your allegiance, okay, where you put your heart. And if I can get people to understand that that is what originally happened, and that's what needs to happen again, then I think there's a greater chance for cohesion in that country to properly and peacefully oppose this monstrosity that is being imposed on them.
Harry, we're coming up to about 15 minutes left, and I wondered if you could just talk a little about today in South Africa.
Yeah.
Because the history is shocking enough, the trials and tribulations of white South Africans, but what they are living with today is worse than anything in our past.
Well, it's worse than anything in the past, and I know people will tell me that it's a, sorry, sort of a maybe unchristian way of looking at it, but back then they had hope. It's difficult to have hope today. It's really difficult. The picture looks unbelievably dark, so dark there isn't even a place for an ordinary white South African to flee to because the world has condemned them to die. That's the way I see the world. When you look at South Africa the way it is right now, I have a couple of loose comments. It's not one massive plan. But there is, without a doubt, a big fight coming between black political factions in the country. It's inevitable. They can't help themselves. They will end up there. I don't have to do anything. Nobody has to, cajole them into it or anything. If you just leave them alone, that's what they're going to do. And my advice to the ordinary white South African is stay out of it. Stay out of it. Okay? Don't get involved there. Don't do it. Okay? This is between them. Leave them alone. When they want you involved eventually, they'll come and ask. So that's number one. Number two, the matter of what should people do at this point. I'm going to make a lot of enemies probably with this statement, but it comes from the heart. Please accept it the way it is intended. You cannot avoid what's coming by making sure that you polish your Mercedes and have nice potjiekos and watch rugby and obliviate your brain that way. Reality will eventually intrude. So you got to think about what is the right thing to do for your family. Just sitting there and say, yeah, the comments I get varies from, oh, it's just the Falkies, you know, going nuts again. That's not it. You are misreading that picture if that's what you're thinking. Okay? This is going to get very ugly. And you got to think about what it is you want to do. So trying to make like it's going to go away if you stick your head in the sand, just that doesn't work. People tell me I ran away. No, I didn't just run away. How about you do this immigration thing and see whether you're tough enough to handle it? Okay? And try and question my commitment and my heart. See what happens. Now, as to being in South Africa, what are some of the options? One thing I've told everyone that's got worried and asked me what to do, and the answer is quite simple. Move west. And I want to show you why I say move west. The last time I visited South Africa was in 2012. And I went all over the show. The only province I was not in was Natal. And going to the rural Western Cape was so dramatically different from going to the rural Eastern Cape. You can't imagine it's the same country. And the reason comes down to yet another map I need to share. So if you'll bear with me. And this map was, let me just see, where can I find it now? It should be in here somewhere. There you go. Tell me if you see it.
We have the
two South Africas. Do you see them?
No, you need to double click on the image again.
Still don't see them. Oh, why is it letting me down? Stop share and go again. Stop that. Exit full screen. We'll try this again. Share screen. Can you see that? Still no luck.
No, Harry.
Oh, no. Okay, well, Zoom doesn't work. I don't know what to do about that. It's kind of a crucial map, so let me see. What can I do about this? Why am I? Go one more time. And still nothing there, I presume, despite my best efforts here. Hold on. Share screen again. And there we go. How's that? Still no luck.
Yes, we can see it now.
You got it. Okay.
Got it.
Okay. This, on the left, you have the design of South Africa by the hand of the good Lord. The green area has summer rainfall over 350 millimeters. The white area, or light orange, has less than 350 summer rainfall. Okay? I've eliminated the bits that get some rainfall just due to a mountain being close, like along like George and Eisner, places like that. But that is South Africa, the way designed. That's what nature looks like in South Africa. Okay, 350 millimeter rainfall to the east, less to the west. Why is that significant? Well, that's the amount of rain you need for grass. And you need grass for cattle. And that is why black people never moved west. There's no grass for their cattle. Their entire cultural structure was based on milk. Now and then they consumed the meat. Mostly it was based on milk. Okay, and for that they need cows, and for that they need grass, and for that they need 350 millimeters of rain. It's that profound, it's that simple, it's that fundamental. Okay, look at the map on the right. That's actually the 2002 electoral map of South Africa, split by racial group in the majority. Who was the majority in the particular voting district? The white area that you see there is where so-called colored people were the majority, and the gray area is where the black people were the majority. It's almost identical. So all of this history I've mentioned to you still applies today to a large degree. Okay, so you got some black people who've gone to Cape Town. Okay, but are you surprised that the DA has won in the Port Elizabeth area? I'm not surprised. There's mostly colored people there. To the west of town in Port Elizabeth, I grew up in Port Elizabeth. To the west of town is colored territory. Okay, Saki Bartman Saval. So my comment to you is the reason why the country is falling to pieces in the east and is not falling to pieces in the west is because of this map. Is that blunt? Okay. I think those white folks who are worried about whether they can maintain themselves in the east need to move to that white spot. The history is behind them, reality is behind them, the rainfall is behind them, the nature is behind them, everything is behind them on that. And then when they get there, they need to drop the idea that they're ever going to have anything racist of any sort. They had better start to understand that the colored people of the West Cape have the same ancestors. Okay? We're one people, irrespective of how dark your skin is or how curly your hair is. Okay? They're one people. Grow up, get used to it. Okay? These people are not your enemies. In fact, they're your friends. Anyone who's lived in the Cape will tell them that. So I'll kill this share screen. So the way I look at it, the white folks and the colored folks in South Africa had better start to understand that they're one group, that their political destinies are intertwined, and they better get together and they better stay out of what's coming between the black folks. And that what's coming between the black folks is going to have a strong overtone of Xhosa versus Zulu. It's inevitable. There's only one thing that a Zulu hates more than a white guy, and that is he hates a Xhosa more.
So Harry, that ties in, you said earlier we may have different views on this, but exactly what you've said now ties in with the Khoi King secession of that exact area from South Africa. And he's holding his hand out to the coloureds, to the Afrikaners, and to the whites, and saying, do this with me. We are stronger together than we are apart. And so possibly we come at this from different reasons or different directions, but the end conclusion is the same. This is good for the white tribe of South Africa.
There's only one problem for me with that. the words are nice, the feelings behind it are good, the intentions behind it are good, all of that's fine. The only thing is, in truth, I don't believe he has any standing whatsoever. I'm not talking about political standing. I'm saying that in history, and I may have to try this idiot sharing process again. I have a map here of the distribution of the various Khoi groups back in the 1700s. Here is the point. There never was a Khoi king. There never was such a creature. There were different tribes. The reason why the black nations of Africa ran like a bulldozer over the Khoi people is quite simple. The black folks got together in something that looked more like a nation. So even the Xhosa tribes were quite sizable. Okay, in the case of the Khoi, it was closer to a clan than anything else. So you had a nation-based society, or a collection of nation-based black societies running like a bulldozer over a bunch of clan-based entities. Okay, back in I think it was in the late 1600s, the different clans, a number of them, actually came to the castle at the Cape to ask the governor's blessing for their individual leaders, that they would recognize those individual leaders. There never was a king of the Khoi. No such entity has existed in history. So I don't know what ticket this gentleman has or what he bases this on, but I don't find it in the real history of South Africa. And that's the problem. So I'm afraid folks are going to laugh him off because there's no such history. Nothing that I can find backs up any such claim. And he seems like a nice enough gentleman. It's just that I don't know who gave him this idea that there's supposed to be some sort of a king somewhere. They never had it. They were always just disparate groupings of folks. And the idea of the Khoi and the Sun together as one grouping, man, it's useful. It's nice because, quite frankly, I have one ancestor who I'm pretty sure was a Bushman in the Graaff-Reinet district. If you have a supposed Khoi ancestor out of the Graaff-Reinet district, more than likely that person was a Bushman rather than Khoi. Okay? I quote Andri Stockenstrom in that matter, that the people who are called Hottentot around Graaff-Reinet are mostly actually Bushmen. So strikes me, with me being a descendant of Eva Krotoa and with her father and Harry the Strandloper, as he was known, being brothers, and Harry being the, quote, king of the Kaapmans at the Cape, it sounds like I have about as much claim to being the king of the Khoi as what this gentleman has, and I don't claim to have any claim. So this is my problem. There's no, I can't find the line. There's no line to follow.
We have it, Harry, and I will make it available to you. I'm sorry to say, and I really am sorry to say this, we've run out of time for today, whereas I could go on for another 2 hours because this is fascinating. So I'd like to know if in the very near future you'll come on again and speak with us again, because this has been an absolutely wonderful learning experience.
Send me the evidence on the subject of the gentleman, who seems to be a very nice guy. I appreciate it.
I will certainly do that because we have his lineage going back. So it would be interesting for you to study it as well. I'd be interested in your viewpoint. And I'll send you some videos as well of other Khoi chieftains that are now calling, that because of the lack of translation of a word, they're calling themselves princes and princesses. And maybe that will make more sense to you if I explain, if I send you that so that you could have a look at it. In the meantime, I'd like to thank you very much, Harry. This has been a wonderful show. I'm so very grateful that you've come on. And you'll be getting another invitation from me almost immediately.
Sorry if it was a little bit of a soliloquy, but you get me started. I'm going to give you the picture.
Well, that is the plan, Harry. The show, we invite you on to hear your point of view, not hear our own voices. So it's meant for you to talk. And it has been wonderful. I can't thank you enough.
My pleasure, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Harry. We've got to go for tonight. Thank you to everyone who's joined us for the show, and I'm sure we'll have Harry Booyens back. That's us for tonight on Stop South African Genocide. It's been great. We'll see you next week. Goodbye.
If we want to change the world, we must first change the media. Mainstream media exists for the purposes of indoctrination and manipulation of public perception. The world of free and independent media is growing, and with the upsurge in information now available in the public domain, it has never been easier to access free and independent media. The exploration of this information resulted in an experimental project which would provide a fully supported space for researchers, whistleblowers, and seekers of all kinds to express themselves and educate the world. On the 1st of January 2015, Conscious Consumer Network was launched to the world. Nobody thought we would make it this far, but CCN is the longest running free and independent media network of its kind. CCN is a unique collaboration of hearts and souls, bringing you information from different perspectives to educate and inform. Since we started CCN, we have had only one desire: the pursuit of a free, fair, just, sustainable world, and this has not changed. Having overcome many challenges over the last 2 years, CCN is here to stay, and we've got great things lined up for 2017. Help keep CCN on the air by supporting the 2017 Network Support Fund.